known because, I mean, we know each other for a really, really long time, but we don't often show our work together, you know, and this is like a really special occasion, I think, to have both of our work, which has been long-term commitment to, I guess, East London, as well as many other spaces. But we would like to invite you to be part of the conversation, really from early on. I think it makes no sense not to do it because probably many of you have something to say, hopefully. So perhaps we just have a couple of questions to each other and then we're gonna watch out for hands. And because it's us two, we might have to be a bit patient because we might just say this and I say no there and whatever. We'll figure it out, yeah. Would you like to start?
You can start.
What shall I start with?
Yeah.
So I made the film. Okay, thank you for the question.
So what I was going to ask is, I know some of your background coming from Germany, and that I think you come from East Germany. Is that right? Oh, you don't. You come. Okay. So I got it totally wrong then. Okay. But where do you think your sort of commitment to, in some ways it's socialism, as in social housing, where do you think that originates from, your commitment to social housing? Because that's, for me, is the sort of foundations of living in London, living in this society, is shared housing. I sort of spent 15 years squatting in the social housing, and then you with social housing. So where does that sort of connection with social housing come from, and is that your main driving force, I suppose?
I mean, it's an interesting question because I grew up in council housing, which is unusual in Germany in the sense that there's rent control. So you have, I mean, it's changed now also since I was younger, but you have a different kind of social makeup that is less extreme, but it's becoming more extreme because neoliberal policies have gone all over across Europe, as well as internationally, of course. So when I came to the UK, what it meant for me is, I think, in the early 90s, when I first came to the UK, I was in co-op housing, and then there were flats given out which were called hard to let. So you could just apply for a council flat, and if you were willing to share and you were willing to repair them, if it was like in a really bad state, you could get one. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable now when we think about it. So I got £400 to do up the flat, which was full with rubbish bins, with bin bags, when I was offered it, and there was 4 of us. And so we have to like fix it up, and it was no problem when you're, you know, when you have the energy and you have the possibility and you have the, youth, I guess, and strength and ability to do it. So it was a really amazing opportunity. But my big commitment, I think, to justice in housing. So this is not my main driving force, but it's much more about looking at justice for people who are living at the edge of precarity, and precarity can mean literally you will lose everything. You will lose everything, and includes perhaps also your mental health most often. And coming from a background that was very precarious and very violent and very unsafe, I know what it means to have a safety of a home. That's the beginning of a beginning of healing for many people when they have the possibility. And it means also enduring a lot of violence when you don't have the possibility, when you're just literally at this edge. So I think in order to have any kind of sense of justice, we have to see housing not as a commodity, but housing as a human right, really. So that's my commitment. And I feel like also, this is lastly, when you have grown up in social housing, for me it was not I looked at estates as a kind of a shared environment where there were many different generations and different people living there, and we made that world possible. Whereas other people might be more afraid. So I've experienced, as soon as I moved into the Haggerston estate, that people wouldn't want to come into the estate because they were afraid of the council estates and the whole stigmatization of sink estates. And that was really, really interesting to me because you literally make these 2-tier people. And I'm now a professor of film, part-time only, but in a university where I still live in social housing. And there are not many people who have this, come from this background in these worlds. So it's like it's constantly having to undo these perceptions that lead us to make policies of othering, right? Policies where we can say these people are not the same, so therefore you're other. And this is literally the last thing, but like in my social housing, we have no access to the roof. So why I said my biography just now was because, you know, I am, you could see on paper, I've entered a certain kind of status of this society, but I have no access to the roof because I'm a social housing tenant and the insurance doesn't cover social housing tenants in my environment to have access to the roof. The private tenants do and have a beautiful roof garden. And there are only so many fights we're fighting for. For example, our playground, which we pay to, is boarded off for the people from our block, and the private people have access to it. But that is not allowed anymore. So there was a big campaign that endured when we were, I think, the last ones where that happened to. So these are kind of the injustices that happen on all sorts of different levels. It just is endless. Anyway, that's my comment. What about you?
Yeah, I came to Hackney in the early 80s and ended up squatting. So I spent over 15 years squatting around Hackney, and ended up at one point. My wife was living in Pamela House actually, which is quite funny. So when we were evicted from one street, I ended up my first time was in Pamela House, but I also lived on the Holly Street estate. So that's where I then we'll go to the Hackney Museum. I had an exhibition there last year. I made a model of a tower block, which is like 10 foot high. There's a couple of people there. But I suppose in that time of squatting, it's exactly what you're saying. You realise how vulnerable you are. I do look back on my squatting time with rose tinted glasses. I always pretend it was the most incredible time, and it was in lots of ways. Because in your film, what I love so much about it is the way everyone rallied together and came together as a community to fight the injustice. And we were living on two streets on Lillingfoot Road and London Lane off London Fields, about 120 of us, and we were all facing eviction. So we all came together as a community to stop the eviction. And that's an incredible energy when you get that, when you're all fighting for the common cause. And then, so housing, ever since I've been in London, has played a big part of me. I do romance it hugely, but at the same time, I only squatted because I couldn't afford places, and it was very hard to find housing. And we all ended up in this position, but it was an incredible part of my life. And then I went into social housing afterwards, and I realised how important social housing is, and that's why I wanted to make the film about the Woodbury Down estate and make it an historical thing, because it was all about that time in the history of this country when there was a vision to look after ordinary people, to build social housing like the estate, the Haggerston estate, the Woodbury Down estate, the Holly Street estate, all basically came from socialism after the Second World War, where there's a vision to give decent housing to ordinary people. And as you said earlier, the way these estates have been stigmatised in Hackney ever since I've been in Hackney, and before, and your bit of documentary footage was talking about that. I hated it. I hated the way all these places were stigmatised, all the people were stigmatised, and all these families were brought up. These wonderful lives were shared, created, gone on to do amazing things. So when I went into the Woodbury Down estate, I was meant to be taking pictures, but I spent a year with an elders group. I'm an elder now. I got my freedom pass, by the way. That's great. But they were elders older than me at the time, and I went there every morning for a coffee morning. Sorry, every week for a coffee morning, and they were telling these stories, and I thought these are just incredible, and I started recording them, and then it had to be a film. So it was an accident. Normally I do photographic projects, but I just couldn't. Every week I was just transported to these incredible worlds, and this incredible dignity, and this incredible belief and belief in this system of giving decent housing. So that's why I made that film. That's a long answer. Yeah.
So I'm already scanning the room, yeah, for hands. Oh yeah, there's a hand in the back.
I just want to say a little bit about Woodbury Down now, so I was really interested that was a 2010 film, and we're now in 2025. So I spend a lot of time on Woodbury Down. I'm the ward councillor for Woodbury Down for Hackney, and I spend an enormous amount of time in community meetings in Woodbury Down, and also council meetings and meeting with the developers and whatever. So I see all sides of it. There's a lot of stuff around about Woodbury Down and gentrification, whatever. One of the brilliant things about it is that the older people's group still exists, is incredibly well attended. I was in a meeting with them today. They get about 60 people on a Tuesday and about 40 people on a Friday every week. And all of those people have moved from the old blocks to the new blocks together. So they didn't knock the building down, shift them out, and then ask them back. They wait until the new building's ready, and so you're moving with your neighbours. So when you're knocking on doors, people go, oh yeah, I've always lived next door to Doris. I've lived next door to Doris for 50 years. We've moved together. And the community organisation involved in the regeneration is incredibly strong. So for all the changes, and the fact there are now private, owners and renters and whatever there's an incredibly strong strand of history through Woodbury Down Estate, and also shared gardens, which everyone knows.
But this is
a little post note.
Yeah, it's great to hear. Yeah.
so nice to hear, and I just want to also add that, for example, on ours, we were seen as the model. So Brandon Lewis, who was the housing officer at some point, we were seen as the model regeneration thing, which was just one generation before Woodbury Downs, I guess you could call it, even though it's around the same time, right? But our shared, what's called city blocks, are preventing people from moving through. So if you're in a city block of shared ownership, you can only be in that shared garden of the shared ownership. If you're in a city block of the private, you can only be in your own private. So there's no more mixing. So the mixing is per area instead of the actual mixing. And in our estate in the film, a third were privately owned, and nobody knew who owned, who didn't. You didn't need to know. And that was really, really utopian for me in a way, because I don't really come from a society where you have home ownership, right? So for me, it's really like a strange idea, and I will never own my own place. But to actually know that we fought together, people who were owning, people who were renting, people who came on the key workers, what was called key worker scheme. But everybody was in it together, and there was no hierarchy, and everybody walked past each other. That for me felt important and really, really beautiful as a possibility in London.
Yeah, amazing.
Hi, question for Andrea. It took you a long time to make the documentary. I'm just quite curious to know why was that? Was that because it's a beautiful film, it has the most magical feeling about it, and I thought, my God, why did it take so long? Because you obviously got everybody on board. So yeah, so what was that? Why did it?
No, thank you. It was because there was 280 hours of footage, and it took a long time, no money at all, like, to make it. We just made it, right? So I trained people up to help early on, and I was just documenting everything, because once we knew it was going to disappear, I wanted to understand what is there. So that's how I discovered the hairdresser, and I just knocked at everyone's door. Then we did the project with the big photographs on the facade. And then I thought, okay, I'm gonna just make this film to go into the archives, into Hackney Archives, as a map for people to know that, so we can't disappear. But then when I saw Bruce bringing down when he was charging his scooter, I found the Flintstones, which led me to Bruce and other people. I was like, there is a film there. Actually, we have to learn to look and to see in a different way, and that takes time. But then also to get these kind of intimate relations with people takes time. Even though they were my neighbors already, because we did a lot of council meetings, we went to so many, actually really good campaigners we had but I just decided it didn't fit in the film in the end, but it's for the archive. So it took as long as it took for the final people to have to move out, which was my block. So it could have taken 3 years, but then it just went on and on and on, and so the filming went on and on and on.
And did you in the meantime make all the different films? Your own films?
All my films take like between 5 and 10 years. Yeah, they all are the same kind of braiding. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I think that's what gives it its magical feeling. You really feel close to all those people, all those characters, and it feels like a really gritty, quite hard to watch documentary at times. But then you're elevated on your way with the literature and the links back into the past, where you're taken away to this dreaming quality, which is really, yeah, it really makes you go in and out, which is quite a beautiful moment. Because I find sometimes these really gritty documentaries just a little bit too depressing sometimes. I don't know about you guys, but I mean, they're obviously very important to make those sort of films. But I feel we need hope, and the way you talk about hope is so important.
Also, the people
Yeah.
were very, very resistant to being
Yeah.
victims, right?
Yeah,
We are not, I mean, I got myself into it because I'm also part of this background and life. And for example, John, who died shortly after, there were two Johns who fought over my cat, Oscar. That's how I got to know them very well. Suddenly it was John's cat, and then it was the other John's cat, and I was the mediator for like 10 years. But John had so much money. He was a tube driver, right? And he had a good pension. So when he died, he had so much money that they found, his family, who then found it much later, and they just threw all, there's so many there's such richness and wealth of life that is lived in ways that is different, that's not financialized. And then when gentrifiers come in, or often family members come in or something, it suddenly becomes about something else, and it becomes quite brutal. Because how do we cost these lives, even when we imagine them as gritty? Because these are, when we see an estate, and it might look gritty, but we live there, right? Like, people live there, and then you see, oh, there's a plant, or there's like someone has the washing out. So it can't be that bad. That's how I see it, right? And whereas the BBC, for example, used to show, this is why I had this BBC clips in there. They would show, oh, this is like a terrible estate, and and the incomers are making it much worse, and everybody had clearly their Sunday best on. It was very neat and tidy, but the voiceover was a completely different one. It was the BBC. So it's infuriating because it's ongoing. It hasn't really shifted. It shifts a little bit, but actually the underlying principles are similar.
yeah. Embedded artists as well. Was there a question? Hi.
I thought both films were really special, and in particular, Estate Reverie, I've wanted to see it for quite a long time, so I was really glad to see it. Can you tell us about the names
Of the houses?
of the films that you chose? Why Estate Reverie and why A Palace for Us?
I know where Palace is.
Well, in the beginning, Joan, the older lady who meets her husband, when I was interviewing her, she describes it as a palace for us. So she was brought up in Shoreditch, the lower part of Hackney, and that was considered to be the slums before the war, and they were cleared, and people were moved out of the inner city to the beautiful suburbs, which was then Woodbury Down, North Hackney. And she described it as a palace for us. I just thought that's such a beautiful description of this very brutalist. So some of the blocks on the Woodbury Down estate, there are different ones, but there are a few of them which are very, very Eastern European brutalist. But I thought that just gave it a lovely contrast to the outside meaning and outside looking at that, which I thought was just, which I really wanted to include. And it was all about, trying to get their voices, to capture them, their memories, their feelings, and trying to talk about that history of that, but make it really personal. And I think that's what we both do. We're both enabling other people to tell their stories, and that was very special. When we had the opening for my film, we showed at the Rio, and we laid on transport for all the residents to come down with the red carpet, and Joan and Jim and Kitty all dressed up in their front row seats. So we had usherettes, not with cigarettes anymore, but with sweeties, and trying to make it. And then we had a big Christmas dinner back at the Woodbury Down as well. So yeah, it's quite a magical feeling to be able to tell other people's stories, isn't it?
And for us, it was, for a long time I wanted it to be called just Estate, but because it's also this, it had to imbue somehow this desire for seeing differently. And so on the one hand, the time when you're losing something, it becomes much more dense. So the community formed around this inevitable disbursement. but also it's a dream of a future that we could have if we were allowed to participate in it in a different way, I feel like. So that's why it had to be a reverie. It couldn't just be estate. And we also showed it at the Rio, and Eric in the film, yeah. So he came to many screenings, not just at the Rio, but other screenings. And people would go especially for him to listen to what will happen next, because he would tell everyone, and then this will happen, and this will happen. It's unbelievable. It was so beautiful.
Yeah, it is. It is very special with that. Where yeah, all the people came down from the coffee mornings, and they were all clearing and chapping, clearing and clapping at all the moments. And oh well, yeah, it makes it very special to be able to share that, and that's very much part of that community engagement, I suppose, which is so important. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
I think it's so nice to hear this, what you just in the back said about the residents still being involved, because we really wanted that too, and it was such a rich, active culture on the estate that did that. And when you see structures, even when you're very prepared for what could go wrong, when you see that go wrong, it's literally this. It's so difficult, because every time we try and revive, we still have a really strong group, but we don't even use a community center anymore because they charge us so much money. It's like we can't afford it, basically, right? So we have to meet in someone's house. So it's actually going back to the new buildings, what we used to do, and organize in a different way. And also, okay, did you want to ask? Yeah.
It's like a very stupid question, but why does the council decide to demolish blocks rather than refurbishing the existing buildings?
I can answer that. Do you want me to answer that? Woodbury Down. Okay. I don't know about Haggerston Estate, but I know about Woodbury Down Estate. So Woodbury Down Estate, the buildings were in a really bad state. Firstly, chronically damp, chronically mouldy, and some of them, the actual spines of the buildings had cracked. So they were really, I mean, they're beautiful, not the brutalist ones, but the 40s ones are really beautiful buildings. But they couldn't fund renovating them to the point that they, the amount that they needed to. What they could do was hand them over to a housing association and a developer to rebuild them. So it's all about who pays the money. So the money that you could get from the developer and the housing association could rebuild those homes, but the money the council had couldn't renovate them. So the funding model is very broken.
It's broken because everybody wanted, so people are not profoundly resistant to change and having additional housing needs, right? So actually we had like architects draw up plans for free several times, and then working with other architects, raising a bit of funding. They were really amazing and innovative solutions to the problem, but it wasn't fundable. And including, what really drives me more mad was we wanted to have a plus energy saving. We were like, okay, now it's gonna be inevitable, it's gonna be demolished, let's make it energy efficient. We've got like D or something. So it's like, it's criminal. Like the way in which the system here works is not great.
Yeah, I mean, when I was working on the Holly Street estate, that was just such a crazy history. It was all back-to-back houses, and then the government decided that they were in bad state, those houses, but the best thing to do, rather than renovate them or change them, was to bulldoze all those streets, and they were actually stopped any more demolishing when they got to Queensbridge Road. So now all the really expensive houses between London Fields and Queensbridge Road are still there because people campaigned to stop those demolitions. Mm-hmm. And then the other side, they knocked them down and built the Woodbury Down, the Holly Street estate, and they had 4 tower blocks and a thing called snake blocks, which were, I think, 5 or 6 floors high. And they said it was the longest corridor in Europe because the blocks went that and that and that and that. But there's lots of different reasons. I mean, I did some research into this when I was at college back in the early 90s. One of the reasons was central government stopped funding local councils for refurbishments and maintaining estates. And that was a terrible thing that happened. So the estates just became sinkhole estates. And then people that were rehoused there were people who who weren't part of that community. So what was really strong communities dissipated into problem communities, and then they were left. And then on the tower blocks, the elevators weren't maintained, the doorways weren't patrolled, so crack dens opened up and all sorts of social problems happened. So by the time Holly Street, when I was doing the work in there, became incredibly bad, and then the idea was to knock it all down and build low-rise terrace houses again, so we went complete full circle. But they did keep one tower block, and that's because the elders group again in that estate campaigned to keep one tower block because they loved them, and they're still there. So they've got a concierge on the door now at the bottom. The lifts work, and it's decent housing again. But it's quite funny that the 3 tower blocks, I built a model of 1 tower block, and that lasted longer than 3 of the tower blocks on that estate. So my tower block, which I made in my friend's bedroom out of cardboard, has lasted for 25 years, and those tower blocks only lasted 20 years, so it's quite crazy. But the one that they did decide to just revamp is just a great place for older people to live. No traffic, no pollution, amazing views across East and West London. So they can be incredible places. Sorry?
And a lift.
And a lift that works, yeah, and a good community hall, so they can work.
You mentioned a bit about kind of the challenges of filming it and what's changed over that time in terms of not being able to use the community centre because it charged too much. I wondered if you guys were making the films again, what you think would have changed and what would have stayed the same. If you were making the films again, where would you film now?
So I had I've been asked many times, would I make Estate now too? And I'm trying to get other people to do it, and it will happen. There are more films to be made. So just as an example, what was very important for me, so for me it's the story of the human and the modern human, right? So the architecture is a character, but it's not the structures are unjust, right? And the injustice is hidden in all sorts of different things. So I'm always looking at why am I perceived this way? Why are the people perceived this way? What is behind it? What has led to that? So they usually, when you look at the billboards, advertisement, new developments, if you look at the pictures of the people, they look, depending on whoever is a royalty at that moment, they look very similar to that. So they imagine communities, imagine wealth, whereas the people who look like people are usually not included in these kind of marketing strategies. So, but it must be influencing us somewhere, right? It influences how we see ourselves, even how we feel am I part of this world, or am I now out of time? Am I still belonging or not? Like Helen the hairdresser, for example, but whose youngest client was in her 70s, But it's important to have these spaces for people who are 70 and above. And me now being in my mid-50s, I can go to over 50. But I think these spaces are really crucial for to have a healthy environment where we actually are all visible and seen and participate. But the new buildings, for example, Estate 2. So the new buildings, you have a fob. We fought so hard against having only a fob to be able to go to your door, which meant that if I wanted to do the shopping for someone who's not well in 3 floors up, I would have to go ring the bell, go up. If I want to bring the shopping down, I would have to go all the way back down, ring the bell, go up. So neighbors couldn't visit each other. So the new architecture is about don't meet your neighbor ever. And everything is just built like this. And so Eric, for example, he couldn't understand how. So all the residents who didn't have a mobile phone were given a mobile phone, which is nice. So they try to really accommodate, right? But if you haven't had a mobile phone, it's probably a reason. So people forgot to charge them. So then they couldn't they couldn't hear the doorbell because the doorbell was linked to the mobile phone. And then a washing machine, it's all digital, it's all hyperlinked. People didn't understand how to use it. Why can't we just have a switch that goes on and off? And so it would be interesting because suddenly you don't, what it does to people is you're no longer functioning. So you feel you're not functioning. So you become old, you become undesired, you become unparticipatory. It's brutal. I think it's brutal in so many different ways. And it's not us who can't do it. It's the structures that make you not do it. Because why do you constantly have to, So when you see it, and or our generation, like, you know, we have seen the analog, we have seen the digital, so there are these kind of really interesting shifts where you actually see the brutality of a system that just wants to sell you something new that costs more, and then when it breaks you have to buy a specialist. Oh yeah, and then we had light bulbs. The light bulbs you could only buy in one particular shop. They were very, very unusual fittings, right? And then because the private flats, which were built as part of the same blocks but with different, so I'm in the portal, they have they had sunken in lights, but the social housing people are not allowed to have sunken lights because we cannot be trusted to change them. So it looked like a lamp shop. Suddenly we had like 6 in a tiny room. It's just unbelievable. And David Roberts, who I work with a lot, he's an architect, right? And he writes a lot about architecture, and he's an activist within these spaces, like really brilliant. He just did his PhD on the work we did there, and he worked on the Balfron Tower. And the whole thing which happened with the Balfron Tower too, which is so brutal, because it was actually great to star listed, which means to keep the social component, and the residents were promised that, but then it was all negative. Yeah, and he was there at that meeting, which is it's absolutely brutal. But anyways, publishing on that stuff loads. So it's interesting, and also equally the floors. You can't have wooden floors because of the noise, but the private ones all have wooden floors. Yeah, so it's clearly not true. We're not stupid people. So suddenly you go like, why are you so different? You can have this, we can have. So if you then break it down into a world, it's gender, racialized, social inequality, you know, everything. You see it.
Yeah, I mean, it is so strange the way Hackney's talked about now with all the hotspots, Chatsworth Road, Broadway Market, London Fields, and then I think we've got, I don't know, but it's 112 council estates. Someone told me once, that's probably slightly wrong, but there are a lot of social housing, but it always seems to be sort of forgotten about unless it's on Top Boy, which I think is very strange as well, that the way they film Top Boy, even though it's about Hackney and it's based in Hackney, they actually went to South London because the estates look more brutal to make it that much more edgy. So that's how you get your representation. So, I mean, any film, any work in social housing, I think is so important to bring out the reality and bring normal people out. Exactly what you're saying, because we seem to be erasing all this social history. And it's being done at such a space, at such a speed, and it is social cleansing. Let's face it, the way it's been done by the media, done by developers, done by the way we navigate and look at our city. So yeah, maybe I should do another one. It would be interesting. There's a tower block at the end of my road. I mean, that's the incredible thing about London, is that you get the most beautiful streets, and at the end of it you get a council estate, and that mixture has always been the magic thing for me about London. It's still not Paris, where you get all the poor people have been moved to the suburbs and they have to bus in every day to do all the essential work, and then the tourists and the bourgeois live in the centre, and then the poor people are bussed out again at the end of the day. London, we've always had this mixture, but that's changing rapidly, and now councils are talking about moving tenants out to Luton, Croydon, all these sort of areas. Even I heard the other day they're moving up to, you know, places like Bradford to get rid of people. So again, that's social cleansing. So it's the thing that most scares me about London, that we're going to end up with this whitewashed, gentrified place which loses it. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah,
Question
I
now.
just wanted to add to what Andrea was saying about this, when the new blocks are being built and there's different things for private tenants and as there are for the compared to the social tenants. And in the block that I'm in, it's an old block, but that in itself is becoming more and more divisive over time, because you've got the original social tenants, you've got people like me who are renting with multiple people off a landlord, and then you've got people who are buying a £600,000 flat next door to mine, which is exactly the same space as mine, but is now like being sold for the 34th time. So you've got 3 sets of like me living with flatmates, you've got a family next door to me who are renting from the council, and then you've got someone slightly further down who owns that same amount of space for a crazy amount of money. So the sense of community kind of changes, because one of the things about social housing is that great leveller, everyone's paying the same rent for the same space. And then suddenly you've got all these kind of difference. So while, yeah, I absolutely love the difference of London and how you can have a council estate at the end of the road next to big houses, it can be really difficult to be in positions where you're paying a lot of rent to a private landlord who bought that property a long time ago for very cheap and is making a lot of money off of you. And then there's someone next door who wants to move in and they can buy it for £600,000. Like, and it becomes this really kind of fight for a right to exist there in your capacity. Like, who am I? How do I exist within this space?
It's similar in the block where I live. I'm in exactly the same situation, and I've found that actually estate agents have started lying to some of the people buying the expensive flats. So it pits people against each other because they move in expecting everyone is an owner like them, find out very quickly they're not, and actually explicitly voice to one another, assuming in elevators that they're talking to another owner, that they hope the renters move out and that they hope the social tenants leave and are forced out because they feel they've been lied to and they haven't got a community that they were expecting either. And then we've got the issue of there's then cultural clashes because in my particular block there's one country where a lot of the young, bright, rich owners are coming from and they're not really that keen on being in the UK and integrating fully and are working in the city in French teams that speak French, and then they're falling out with my long-term French neighbours who greet them in English and they're saying, well, you finally speak it. So it's getting more and more complicated in my block, but the thing that's happened is that the people who are second, third generation social tenants, when we were all kind of getting along really well and pleased that we had intergenerational community, they're not sitting outside anymore, they're not as welcome in the outside space anymore. So it's really kind of causing a lot of conflict within the community that the external people making the most money out of it are creating.
I think that's all just down to lack of social housing, isn't it?
Yeah.
We do desperately need social
And
housing.
lying
Not just,
is a commodity, like you said. If
yeah,
housing
yeah.
is a commodity and you lie to sell it and you're allowed to lie to sell it.
Yeah.
I mean, the renters union, I would recommend anyone who's renting and anyway to just join the renters union, because I think the numbers, if there's more and more numbers, I mean, this is like a very hopeful, kind of very, very terrible renter situation. But the more numbers there are, the more strength there will be. And that's, I mean, that was set up for that. There has to be some sort of, change in the system, and that has to be coming from I guess, the grassroots, because the government is not doing enough. Or nothing, actually.
Yeah.
Not enough.
I'm really sorry, we've got another stream in here in about 10 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can we just ask one more question? Because there's just one.
Okay.
You've had your hand up for ages, and then
Oh,
we.
no, thanks very much. You touched a wee bit before on sort of some of the structural aspects that might inhibit kind of community building in some of these properties. But I wondered if you had any reflections on how wider societal changes might affect that community building. So things like, people get things delivered to their house so they're not out of their properties as much. People have better health care so they don't depend on their neighbours in a way that we maybe used to, or we no longer go to a laundrette, that may be a communal type of space. I just wondered if you thought that the ease at which our communities and our kind of predecessors might have built community is likely to have changed forever, and in 30 years' time a film like this might, or like these might be very different.
But this is a really, really excellent point, because so I'm in the Porto, and we always talk like our neighbors. We are like, we have to be careful in the mornings, when you're in a rush, because everyone wants to chat, and we do it live rather than, and there's many people get deliveries, but I think you cannot cut short the talking to each other in order to fix stuff, or anything. You have to, that's all we have. Let's not be divided. And I think the idea of community fills me also sometimes with dread, because it means you're excluded from it. Many people are excluded from it, right? It's like a queer person in Hackney at a certain time, it wasn't very friendly, even though there were always queer people on the estate too, but it, or people of color, like there's so many different kind of layers where communities are really pushed out, especially in the kind of London, East London. So community is also like a thing that has to be very porous. But I feel like we need that space. And during, for example, the COVID, our local shop was unbelievable, because we knew all the people who bought up all the toilet paper everywhere. Our local shop would know who bought a lot of toilet paper and who didn't.
Actually.
And it was there waiting for those who didn't. So you know, it's I don't think we can shortcut and ever get rid of another connection. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.